stay tuned because we're talking about battered men and the women who batter them next on Fathers Are Parents Too. Welcome to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Eric Towle, who is a family violence counselor who has made it at least part of his specialty to work with and talk about battered men and the women who battered them. Welcome, Eric. Thank you for being here. That's really actually a not uncommon problem, isn't it, even though we don't really often hear about it?
Well, yeah, it's probably one of the least publicized sorts of family violence problems there is, you know.
Now, I think people probably assume it's because it's, you know, not very common. Is that why you don't hear about it? Is it not very common?
Well, no, actually, it's extremely common. You know, one of the reasons you don't hear about it is because our society has certain cultural expectations and prejudices around gender behavior, and generally, you know, our mythology around men is that they are the ones who are the warriors and the hunters and that sort of thing, and they are basically the ones doing the attacking and physical kind of violence and that sort of thing, and the idea of a man being assaulted by, especially by a woman who our cultural expectation hasn't been that the woman is going to be, you know, violent, and so it's a situation that people don't expect. It doesn't fit our cliches about families.
You know, I would almost take that a step further in the culture now, and sort of the common mythology, as you put it, is that not only are men hunters, but there's a real culture we have now that women are victims and men are always the aggressors and batterers. Isn't that the case? And
yeah, I think absolutely. There is a growing movement in America that really seeks to popularize the victim mentality and to see, especially with respect to family violence, women as victims primarily.
And I think, in my experience speaking it now as an attorney who works with men, what I have seen is a lot of times that's because the people working in the family system and law enforcement, and tell me if this is borne out by what you've seen, but it seems to be they have become necessarily sensitive to the issues, but perhaps oversensitized. And what I mean by that is, I know that I have dealt with clients who were battered, but the police were absolutely sure when they were called for a domestic violence situation that it must have been the guy who was the batterer, and even though the guy I was dealing with was the one who was bruised and scratched and bleeding, and the woman had no marks on her, it was still the man that was arrested. So I would say we've actually gone, is that what you see from your end of it as well?
Yeah, certainly. In the work that I've done, I've seen many men who were arrested for domestic violence and were actually the ones who called the police when they felt that they could no longer handle a situation where they were being assaulted by their partner, and ended up being the one arrested. You know, oftentimes the police arrive and a man may have certain marks on him and may be very angry. The woman more often than not will be extremely upset and crying, and may appear, you know, the situation may appear as if, especially to someone who is looking at it with a kind of, coming at it from a more traditional kind of perspective on male and female behavior, that, you know, here is a man that's assaulted his wife, she's upset, and the marks on him are really just from her defending herself. And there's that kind of prejudice that if any assault has occurred against the man, it's because the woman is defending herself.
You know, you just reminded me, I know a fellow who said that when he called a battered women's shelter seeking assistance for himself, they told him, if you would stop making, you know, if you would stop battering your wife, she wouldn't have to defend herself and hit you. And it was just, it was just amazing.
That's the cliche.
So it is happening. And if it's happening and it's not that it's rare, why don't we hear about it?
Well, the whole domestic violence advocacy sort of work in America is pretty much dominated by women's groups who feel that to mention anything about the violence that men may suffer is going to take away from their major message that women are the predominant victims. that is something that is up for debate. If one looks at the major research on family violence in America, we see the research actually telling us that it's more of an equal kind of field out there in terms of who's assaulting who. But the popular work that's been done by women's groups that's really controlled the rhetoric in this field has popularized the notion that women are the predominant victims, and that is the message the public has received quite strongly.
So now how do you deal with, I imagine that when people hear you speak about men as victims of battery, some of them do have that very response that you mentioned that the women's groups have. They don't want the violence against women minimized. And how do you respond to that? By saying, you know, when they say you're detracting from this very big concern, and granted, it is a big concern.
Certainly is, yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that, you know, what I would like to do in my work is to begin to look at family violence in a way that we can kind of remove the gender politics from the whole discussion. I would like to be able to look at a family who's having some problems with abuse in terms of the individual merits of that particular case and not get wound up in whether it's the man or the woman or who's doing what to who and whether it's more often men than women and those questions. And we need to just look at people as individuals. That is my position, really. And whether it's going to detract from the work done to help battered women, I don't think that's really true. I think it's something that if we begin to look at just who needs help, regardless of what gender they are, I think there's room for everyone to get the assistance they need.
Now, your background is in clinical psychology with an emphasis on family violence. So have you seen in your work or your research any major difference in the dynamic of women and men batterers? And what I'm thinking is an answer to what you said, a response would be, well, yes, but women come at violence differently and for different reasons, and they were made to be violent by the men, or whatever the response would be. But in reality, are the dynamics that different, or is it a human condition that applies equally to both genders?
Well, certainly research has demonstrated that no matter how human beings couple, whether it's heterosexual people or gay or lesbian couples, there is always the possibility for family violence. In fact, some of the initial research done on lesbian couples has showed even a higher rate of domestic violence than heterosexual. So it is a situation where you know, this is a problem across the board for everyone concerned. I'm sorry, what was the main question?
Just whether there was a difference in the dynamic between male and female violence. But actually, let's go off that, because you raised something else that I think is rather interesting, which is in terms, now you mentioned that in lesbian couples the rate of violence is higher, which reminded me that I had recently read that recent studies show that domestic violence perpetrated by men, male abusiveness, has actually reduced in the past several years by a fairly significant factor. But women batterers, the incidence of female perpetrated domestic violence has risen.
It has.
Which may or may not be relevant to lesbian violence being higher, but my thought was, you know, generally women seem to be getting more violent. And I'm wondering, is that because women are getting away with it? Is it because they know men won't report it? Men seem to have gotten the message it's not okay, and yet why are women even doing it more now?
Well, I think it's part of the liberation of women as a whole. I think that what our culture has become very good at is being able to accept now in a major way that women can do all of the positive things that men can do in terms of you know, being a corporate president, or being a police officer, or a fire personnel, or in a military position. Before you know, careers that were dominated by men, we now are you know, have been asked to, and the public seems to have accepted the idea that women can do all of these jobs just as well as men. These are all positive ways of using a kind of directed aggression. And what our society has yet to really come to grips with is the idea of accepting that if a woman can use that kind of positive aggression for police work, she can also use negative aggression for organized crime or something like that. If a woman can be the head of a corporation, she could also be the you know, the head of a crack dealing ring or something like this. With the expansion of women into all of those areas of life that men used to dominate, they're not only entering the positive ones, but the negative ones as well.
Generally, female power is being
it's going
freed
everywhere. We're not keeping it just in the paths that you know, some people would like it to.
So now, what happens to these guys who are battered when they realize they have a problem? Apparently they're not reporting it if we're not hearing about it. What do they do? What sort of, is there a common um, theme among male battery victims as to how they respond and what they do about it, if anything, and how they deal with it?
In terms of how they respond, most of, within the relationship itself, a lot of men, attempt to appease their partners and make, concessions to them and attempt to basically adapt themselves in order to keep their partner from becoming volatile and violent. And it becomes a game where the more they adapt, the more the partner seeks more power in the relationship and begins to sort of push the limits even farther. And so they find themselves being pushed and pushed and pushed. They adapt and change, and they get to a point to where there's no more room left to adapt and do things differently. And oftentimes they've neglected their own needs to the point to where that becomes a personal issue of aggravation about their own issues. And so they end up becoming abusive themselves sometimes, and ending up then realizing, what is going on with me here? I've never been this way in the past. This isn't the way I want to live. And then they begin to seek, someone in a professional field such as myself who can help them out with the problem. As far as any established kinds of networks for battered men, I don't know of any. Sometimes they'll contact some men's rights organizations, and they might be able to direct them to sympathetic therapists. I know of many men who have attempted to contact women's shelters thinking, well, they work in this area, and usually that has been an unpleasant experience for them. They've gotten a certain amount of ridicule or just been brushed off in those situations. So it can be difficult.
And is that part of why men typically don't report abuse to the authorities or to, other than a few professional, as you said, therapists perhaps? Is it because of ridicule or disbelief, or why don't men report this? Why is this so underreported?
Well, they do. Many men that I've treated have told me about their attempts to report their situation to the police, or when the police may end up at their home, on a domestic disturbance call to attempt to talk to the officers, and many times they get a kind of reaction like, oh, come on, buddy, what are you telling us here? You're a big guy like you, and your wife is picking on you. Come on. A lot of times the officers won't even make they won't even make a report or include it in a report that they're making about the situation, and it becomes frustrating for them. So
it almost seems that, as I'm listening to you, that we've come full circle. It's a very sad circle, but where the problem used to be, it seemed that it was just assumed that family violence, where men had the control over women, and that was something you just dealt with in the family. And if women tried to report that they were being abused, people would look the other way, and they weren't very concerned. And now it almost seems that it's the reverse is true. As I said, we've come full circle, and that it's okay now for women to beat their husbands. I mean, it's not okay, and I don't think any women's advocates would say it is either, but it almost seems that way. We legitimize it by either ignoring it or disbelieving it, or it's got to be a very frustrating feeling for these men.
Yeah, a lot of them, the stereotype is that these men, they're not really being hurt. I had a client a while back who was actually a member of a law enforcement agency, and he was a very large man, very muscular, large man, and his wife was quite petite, actually. And the idea, I mean, if you looked at the two of them, the idea that this woman had been battering him for years would just seem absurd. If you looked at the two of them, you would think, my God, this guy can certainly take care of himself. And it wasn't the physical harm that was being done here, but he was just slowly being psychologically debilitated over time to a point where it was becoming a serious problem for him, serious emotional debilitation from just always being assaulted, attacked, never knowing when it was going to happen and that kind of thing. And he certainly could have, put her through a wall anytime he wanted to, but he wasn't doing that, and it didn't have anything to do with the difference in their size. That wasn't a factor in the conflict. And so many times people make the mistake of believing, well, since the man is bigger, he's not going to be affected by these situations. And oftentimes that has nothing to do with it.
And I imagine they also don't take into account that men now have been very sensitized and raised to not, you don't hit women. You
Oh,
just don't
absolutely.
do that.
That's the tradition.
Okay, well, we are going to take a break, and when we come back, we have some questions for you from the audience.
Great.
Okay, we'll be right back.
I'd like to talk to you about divorce. Not what it means to you as a parent, but what it means to your children, coming from someone whose parents are divorced. Some divorced parents feel the need to involve their children in disagreements by putting the other parent down. If you're a parent, step-parent, girlfriend, or boyfriend of someone who is involved in a divorce, please don't involve the children in the issue. It's a terrible feeling for someone to hear negative things about the other parent, no matter how old they are or how true or insignificant you feel the comment is. You also have to know that the effects of trying to cut the other parent out of your children's life are even more devastating. FREE, the Father's Rights and Equality Exchange, is an organization that firmly believes in having both parents in your child's life. For more information, call 1-500-4-DADS. I'm lucky in the fact that my mother has never interfered with my father's relationship. In fact, she's always encouraged me to stay involved with him. But coming from someone who's been through a divorce with my parents, I realized that by giving comments to your children that are negative about the other parent, it will only cause them to resent you. My parents may not always agree with each other, but I know I'm glad to have both of them in my life, and your kids will be too. Right, Mom?
Right. Welcome back to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with family violence counselor Eric Towle, and we have some questions from the audience for Eric. Yes?
How severe do you find the problem of non-violent emotional abuse by a custodial mother against her ex-husband through the children, using the children as tools and weapons of hatred? Is that a severe problem that you address?
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that. You know, oftentimes I'll have men come in and report that they are victims of this kind of abuse, and I work with them around dealing with the fallout from it and being able to work with their children on that whole dynamic. But yeah, oftentimes, you know, the person who really needs to be talked to is the person who is, you know, causing the abuse, and that individual generally will not come in, you know, doesn't want to have anything to do with talking about what's happening. So oftentimes it's just a matter of counseling the individual around how to sort of do some damage control with their child and develop some kind of compassionate perspective on the situation without getting involved in some kind of conflict and attempting to minimize that kind of exchange of vehemence going on between the parents in whatever way that they can. So that's basically most of what happens in those questions.
That has just got to be so incredibly damaging to the children. I mean, it's also damaging to the targeted parent, but
Yeah.
you know, to just put the children through that is like putting them through a meat grinder.
Absolutely, yeah. The child gets the worst of it, and that's the thing that I try to, in some way, have explained to the individual who's perpetrating that kind of abuse that they're not really hurting the person they think they're targeting. They're really just damaging their own children. But there's a lot of frustration around that issue. You know, people, no matter how many times you tell them that, they just seem to not be able to help themselves. They just want to find a way to. Usually it's because they're insecure about their relationship with the children and they're trying to break off what's going on with the other parent, and they've got their own deep-seated issues that they're not dealing with well. So.
Okay, we have another question for you. Yes?
What do the courts currently define as abuse? In other words, is verbal and emotional abuse considered a relevant issue, or do the police have to see some physical evidence rather than mental abuse?
You know, before you answer that, Eric's not an attorney, and I mean,
Yeah.
you're welcome to answer that if you can. I just want to give you a chance to get off the hook.
Sure, yeah. I don't know exactly what the legal definition is, because it is, as far as I know, it's a little bit fuzzy. It becomes down just to an interpretation by a judge generally. But Yeah, verbal abuse is something that really can't be proven when the police arrive, and generally if a person is going to actually be charged with spousal abuse, there has to be some kind of mark on them or something. That's the technical application of the law. Oftentimes there isn't a mark and the person gets charged with it anyway, and I don't know how they exactly work that out legally, but technically it's supposed to be a corporal injury upon a spouse, which could even be a red mark of some kind. You don't get that with psychological or verbal abuse. But
now, one thing you may know that is related to that in terms of the legalities and mechanics is the issue of mandated reporting. Who, for example, you practice in California, I believe.
yeah.
I think almost everyone in California is a man. In fact, I think the newspaper delivery guy might be a mandated reporter at this point.
Just about. Yeah, they're working on that. Yeah.
And can you talk about that just for a moment? We have another question for you, but I think that's a big issue. A lot of people don't realize. In fact, I've dealt with cases where mom went to a mandated reporter, say a pediatrician, concerned about a mark on the child, really genuinely concerned, having no idea what she was unleashing. You know, suddenly dad was caught in this maelstrom of you are an abuser, and that happens with adults as well, not just with kids with marks or what have you. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, well, there has been a lot of work attempting to draw many different people in schools and even the job workplace, especially physicians and nurses, into reporting, especially child abuse, and now there's more emphasis on spousal abuse. And a lot of people, it's gotten into a kind of, unfortunately, there's paranoia around this issue on the part of professionals of just wanting to cover themselves, so they report everything. And it does create real problems for people unnecessarily. And yeah, that situation needs to be sorted out somehow.
I know a young woman who recently went to the doctor. It was a clinic for a pregnancy test, and she said that all throughout the whole exam, and her partner was there and just very gentle and loving, and they took her in a room alone and said, "Now, do you have any problems in your relationship? Is your is your partner beating you?" "Well, no, he's wonderful." "No, you sure?" "No," and it was almost like she said she felt like they wanted her to say he was doing. I mean, it was just insane. Anyway, we have another question for you. Yes.
Hi. As someone who is verbally battered daily for his entire marriage, and in the interim, in the 2.5 years since the marriage, that continues, I think that this is a problem that is really still in the closet and is much deeper than any of us really have even begun to acknowledge. I think it's on the level of racism. I think the things that you've touched on, the idea that a man should have to call a women's shelter is a joke. I mean, the idea of having the police come out is a joke. Nothing's going to happen there. If you look at the language that we have built into the law, everything that has to do with battering like that, the pronoun her is used. I know that my wife, because of the perception that we have in this society, felt that she had unlimited permission to verbally batter me, including cursing me in public while holding my children, and that I was well aware that if I ever struck once, that one blow of mine would be perceived as greater than several thousand daily blows. I wonder how this can really be brought into the open in a real way, not just through counseling or the police, but how can it be brought into the national consciousness?
Yeah. Well, I think that you bring up a very good point. We need to begin to recognize that people can be much more severely damaged individually on an emotional level and a psychological level than being struck physically. I've had many men in my office tell me that they would rather this person just simply slug them once a week than go through the constant emotional berating that they have to deal with. And it is something that we need to look more carefully at. And we have a very physically oriented kind of perspective in the United States, very material oriented, and so psychological things are so much more nebulous for people, and we need to begin to realize the reality of those kinds of effects, the very real lasting effects.
We have time for one more very quick question. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering if there's any sort of guidelines when someone accuses someone else of some sort of abuse. And do they have to be brought together to, discuss it? I've heard of stories where the one person, male or female, says things about the other side, and they're never brought together. So there's no, not. You think of a court situation where they talk, but
You mean legally?
I mean, even a therapist, do they have to see them together?
Verifying remarks about what's really going on. Yeah.
You've got about 30 seconds to address
Yeah.
that.
Well, I think that one of the main things is that what you have to deal with individuals is not just what's objectively happening, but someone's perception and how they're actually feeling about it. Whether the other person is actually doing something or not, you have to pay attention to how that person is receiving things and really work on their individual psychology around how they're feeling about what's going on, and sometimes it's counterproductive to attempt to verify everything.
So
But,
verification of facts is almost the facts are almost sometimes, I think, unknowable. It's
Absolutely.
understanding the perception.
Yeah, you can chase your tail for a long
Now,
time.
if people wanted to get in touch with you either locally in order to avail themselves of your services, or even from across the country, as this is seen, the show is seen indeed across the country, just to touch base with you on these issues, because there aren't many people speaking about it,
Yeah.
may they call you, and where
Absolutely.
would they do so?
Yes, please do. If you have any questions about this issue, call me at 408-920-3136 here in California, and I'd be glad to talk to you about the situation.
Okay, now very quickly, we have about a minute or so left. If you had one message you could give to all those guys out there who are dealing with this, that are watching this show, what would you say to them?
Well, the main thing I think men should understand is that if you do feel you're being abused, try to distance yourself from the situation before you begin to react in a way that is going to get you into trouble. That's the main message, is keep an eye on yourself, keep track of your emotional state and your tension, and know when it's time to take a break and get out of it, so that you don't end up retaliating and getting yourself into a lot of trouble over the situation.
And for those men who aren't fortunate enough to be in the area where someone like you is there one particular resource you would suggest they call above any?
Well, you might call the National Coalition of Free Men is an organization that exists all over the country that deals with men's rights issues, and many times they can direct you to proper people.
Okay. And then people can also call the Free Foundation, although the National Coalition of Free Men is more focused towards that as well. Eric, thank you so much for being here. This is a very important subject, and I'm really glad that you are here speaking about it, and I wish you luck spreading the message. It needs to get out there.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And audience, thank you for being here, and thank you, and we'll see you next week on Fathers Are Parents Too.